Mhm. Are there moments of expansion where you can literally feel your body open up to receive the information, to receive the culture? Are there moments of fire where you're inflamed by social justice and inequities that are happening? So when you hold up that mirror, it allows you to have a better gauge of how you're responding to the material. And so I just want to offer up, in order to be present the entire time, you're constantly going to need to reground yourself. So for me, grounding looks like spreading out my toes, feeling the earth underneath me, really feeling my roots sink down deep so that I can receive all that's happening. Grounding also looks like orienting, looking around, turning my body, turning my psoas, because I come from a people who have experienced enslavement and genocide and different things that have happened to my body. So reminding myself that I am here now and that I am able to have agency over how I respond to this information and how I act now. It might look like movement. It might look like a shakeout, right? Like, whoo, I got to release this. I got to be able to um, shake out what's happening in my body so that I can reground and be present again. And it might also look like touch, right? Like, oh, I'm connected. I'm connected with Sarah. I'm connected with Shannon. I'm connected with my higher self, right? And so being able to have these different points to offer up for as you're looking in that mirror, that you can continue to ground, orient, move, and elicit self-touch to be able to be present and receive. So if you have further questions around healing centered engagement, I really encourage you to go back and watch our first webinar. But Shannon and I will be here and we're happy to address questions in the chat. But I know that Sarah is going to expand upon so much of this in her presentation today.
We're so excited to be in partnership with NICWA and to have Sarah with us today, who's an enrolled citizen of the Native Village. Sarah, can you share us how to pronounce your...
The O is silent, so it sounds like Uzinki.
Uzinki, thank you. And became the executive director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association in January of 2015. Prior to joining NICWA as the chief of staff in 2011. And Sarah led the National Congress of American Indians Welfare Reform Program, and in 2003 was the founding director of NCAI's Policy Research Center. She began her career at the Bureau of Indian Affairs Central Office as a child welfare specialist. And we are so grateful to be in community with you today and to hear more from your expertise and wisdom and the learnings. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the warm welcome this morning and all of the support and help today with the conversation that we're going to have. So I just want to say Chamai to all of you. I want to greet you in my native Alutiiq language and tell you that I've been looking forward to being here with you. And this morning I got up early to think about this time and to pray about how we would be together here today. So I'm really happy to be here today and to share with you a little bit about the history of federal Indian policy in this country. And importantly, in the second half of our time together, to share with you about a framework called the relational worldview that can be useful in helping us to make that pivot that Dr. Nish was just talking about. So that pivot from distancing ourselves from what's going on, using a structural lens or a structural analysis to think about Native issues and communities, and to really pivot to using a mirror to understand some of the ways that we can support healing-centered engagement. We have about 2.5 hours together today. We have some slides to share with you. I also wanted to introduce a practice of some 4-minute pauses for some reflection and journaling. So go ahead and find a sheet of paper and a pen so you can jot some notes down. We do also have some slides with prompt questions, but you can also just ask questions anytime. So please do put them in the chat, and we'll have some points in time where we invite you to raise your hands and come off mute and talk with us. So really do hope that this can be as engaging as possible, although we are in a virtual format. At the top of the hour, in about 45 minutes, we're going to take a 10-minute break. And then when we come back together, we'll watch another short video, a 5-minute video about the Indian Child Welfare Act, and then get back into our presentation. And I also just wanted to share upfront that some of the content that we're talking about today could really impact you. It could be distressing to you. It may be hard to hear. And so if you need to turn your camera off or step away for a few minutes to grab some water or feel more grounded, then we welcome that. We welcome you taking care of yourself. And also may want to be thinking about whether there's somebody that you could reach out to this afternoon or this evening if this lands on you particularly hardly. So already be thinking about your support network and somebody that you could talk to if you feel like you need that kind of support later today. So we'll go ahead and get started then. We'll move to our next slide, and I wanted to start in a good way. And so in the tradition that I come from, that means starting with a blessing. And a newer practice that we have around land acknowledgements. So the blessing that I wanted to start with today is a blessing written by Jan L. Richardson, and it's called Blessing in the Chaos. To all that is chaotic in you, let there come silence. Let there be a calming of the clamoring, a stilling of the voices that have laid their claim on you, that have made their home in you, that go with you even to the holy places, but will not let you rest, will not let you heal your life with wholeness or feel the grace that fashioned you. Let what distracts you cease. Let what divides you cease. Let there come an end to what diminishes and demeans, and let depart all that keeps you in its cage. Let there be an opening into the quiet that lies beneath the chaos, where you find peace that you did not think possible, and see what shimmers within the storm. I also wanted to offer a tribal land acknowledgement, and I'm joining you today here from Portland, Oregon, where the National Indian Child Welfare Association is headquartered. And so I want to share a land acknowledgement for the Portland metropolitan area. And this land acknowledgement was developed by a local service provider here for Native families called the Native American Youth and Family Center. Historically and contemporarily, Native people lived throughout what is now Oregon and Washington. The Portland metropolitan area is vast and includes modern-day cities such as Portland, Vancouver, and many others. It covers both sides of the Columbia River and both sides of the Willamette River, spanning surrounding counties such as the Clackamas, Columbia, Multnomah, Washington, Yamhill, Clark, and Skamania. In this immense area, there were numerous tribes, villages, and peoples that honored and stewarded the abundance that the lands offered. We honor their history and acknowledge the sacrifices that they made. The tribes who are in the Portland metropolitan area include Multnomah, Wasco, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia and Willamette rivers. We also acknowledge the present-day federally recognized tribes of this area, the Grand Ronde, Siletz, and Cowlitz, as well as the Chinook Nation, who's been seeking federal recognition for many years. The urban Indian community in Portland is diverse, representing more than 380 tribes from across the country. We have a vivid history made up of people whose journeys brought them to Portland, both through forced displacement and voluntarily seeking greater economic and educational opportunities. Today, these tribes and communities celebrate their heritage, showing resilience and tenacity, and contribute their diverse cultures and ways of life to our social fabric and economy. Thank you. We'll move to the next slide, please. I wanted to share at the outset what we're going to be talking about today, what our goals are for this conversation. I want to share with you a little bit about the global recipe for colonization and to talk specifically about a couple of the major policy periods here in the United States that really impacted Native peoples and communities. So we want to talk a little bit about those impacts. How did these policies impact Native children, their families, and their communities? And then throughout our conversation today, give you an opportunity to reflect on your experience, if any, with Native families and communities, and how you might lean into cultural humility with the goal of using some of these frameworks, some of this information for cross-cultural communication and engagement. So really thinking about that healing-centered engagement and how this kind of background information and framework can support you in taking that step. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda. We're going to get up the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to talk about some terminology and make sure we all understand what the terms that we're using mean. We want to make sure everybody has the same understanding. I'll share a little bit about federal Indian policy, and then we're going to talk specifically after the break about culture and worldview. And we're going to compare and contrast linear and relational worldviews and the values that are associated with them and the way that they understand change, the theory of change from both a linear and relational worldview. And I'm hopeful that this will give you some good frameworks and tools to really think about that healing-centered engagement. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some terms. So I wanted to distinguish between these terms. I wanted to talk a little bit about what they each mean. So when we use the term American Indian or Indian, we're talking about people who are indigenous to the contiguous 48 states, the lower 48 as we call it. I'm from Alaska, so we often call it the lower 48. A different group of people are Alaska Native people. And we're often differentiated because we have a different history and land settlement policy and jurisdiction. So there are a number of ways that our population is distinct from Indigenous peoples in the lower 48. And so we often talk about them as different groups because of some of those historical differences. And in both of these first two, American Indian and Alaska Native groups, these folks can often be citizens of federally recognized tribes, as well as be members or affiliated with unrecognized or state recognized tribes. And we'll talk about that more also. Native Hawaiian people are often distinguished because, again, they have a different set of legal rights than American Indian and Alaska Native peoples. And an important distinction is that Native Hawaiians are not recognized as governments in the way that American Indian and Alaska Native populations are organized into tribal nations. Native American is a term that's a more general term. It includes all three of these groups that I just talked about, and it also includes Pacific Islanders, so it's a broader term. Native is a shortened form of Native American. It usually refers to the same set of groups unless otherwise noted, unless people mention that they're using it in a different way. Indigenous is a term that I often use to refer more globally to people who are Indigenous or native to a particular place. So I often talk about American Indian, Alaska Native when I'm talking about peoples here in the United States. And I personally use the term Indigenous when I'm talking more globally about people who are native to a place. And then finally, it's important to think about tribal affiliation also. So the association, whether it's membership or citizenship or an affiliation that a Native person has with a particular group. And so if we're talking about individuals or communities, terminology also is about identity. So different people have different preferences. And you can always ask people how they prefer to be identified, what they prefer to be called. And I also just wanted to note that we don't differentiate all of these things just for the sake of political correctness, but it's actually particularly in this policy context that we're going to be talking about, the legal terms really matter. So my advice is always, particularly in a policy perspective, to use precise terms, to actually use a term that says specifically what we mean. Because in a policy context, when we're identifying challenges or gaps or something to address, we want to make sure that the solution that we're thinking about, that we're going to advance, really matches the specific population. So particularly in a policy context, being precise about the groups that we're talking about is really important. So we'll move to the next slide then. And I'll just talk a little bit about tribal governments pre-contact. So before colonization, tens of millions of indigenous peoples inhabited North America and governed complex societies long before European governments sent explorers over to seize lands here and to take resources from the continent and its inhabitants. These foreign European governments interacted with tribal nations in diplomacy, in commerce, in culture, and in war. And importantly, they acknowledged indigenous systems of social, cultural, economic, and political governance. Native nations have remained political powers from the colonial period until today and continue to engage in commerce, trade, cultural exchange, and have in fact inspired the principles of freedom and democracy that are enshrined in the US Constitution. As the United States formed a union, the founders acknowledged the sovereignty of tribal nations alongside states and foreign nations and the federal government in the US Constitution. So this acknowledgement, this recognition is also enshrined in the US Constitution. Next slide, please. So the history of federal Indian policy and its impact on tribal governments is often described by scholars as a pendulum that swings back and forth. And this is a nod to the notion that if we look throughout history, we can see how policy oscillates on the one hand between assimilation as the solution to the quote unquote Indian problem. So the way to deal with tribal communities, the way to deal with Native people is to try to assimilate them into the mainstream population. So that's one side of the pendulum swing. Or on the other side, swinging back totally in the opposite direction, is the recognition of inherent tribal sovereignty and support of tribal self-determination. So as we look back through policy, we can see that pendulum swinging back and forth as different administrations come into power, as different events are happening globally in the world, as Native nations themselves are gaining more power or more resources. You can see that federal response, the federal policy swinging back and forth between these two extremes, between forced assimilation on the one hand, and between recognition of inherent tribal sovereignty and self-determination on the other hand. At its heart, the federal Indian policy that we're going to be talking about is about the treatment of Native nations. It's about how the federal government interacts with, engages with tribal nations. And it's important to acknowledge tribal nations as part of the unique American family of governments, as nations within a nation, as well as sovereign nations in the global community of nations. So we'll move to the next slide, please. So when we talk about tribal nations here in the US, there are 574 federally recognized tribes. They are variously called tribes, bands, rancherias, pueblos, communities, native villages. So there's lots of terms to describe them. but there are 574 tribes that have a nation-to-nation relationship with the United States government. And these 574 tribes are located in 35 states across the United States. There are 63 state-recognized tribes that are located in 11 states. So some state governments have the practice of acknowledging, recognizing tribes at the state level, even if they don't have federal recognition. And there are more than 100 tribes that are in the process of seeking federal acknowledgement, which is a very laborious, cumbersome, bureaucratic process. And something that often takes decades for tribes to go through. But more than 100 tribes are somewhere in that process seeking federal recognition. And then there are 334 federally and state recognized reservations. So not all tribes have a land base as part of the policy history that we're going to be talking about. But there are 334 reservations. And collectively, those are about 56 acres. So that's about 2.3% of the total US land base. Next slide, please. So here we're going to pause for a minute and we're going to invite a 4-minute reflection. So in my cultural background, the number 4 is an important number. And it is one of the ways that we think about wholeness. And we'll be talking more about that later. But for this 4-minute reflection, just wanted to give you an opportunity to think about what you know about Native peoples and tribal nations and where and how you learned about that. So we're going to take a couple minutes here and offer you that opportunity.
If you could wrap up your thoughts in like the next 20 seconds.
Great, thank you, Shannon. So we'll move to the next slide, and we want to invite you to raise some questions now. Anything that you're thinking about, anything that you're curious about, that you want to know more about, just based on this brief introductions. You can feel free to drop your questions in the chat or to raise your hand and come off mute, but be happy to talk with you now about anything that's come up for you so far in our conversation.
Hi there.
Hey.
Hi, Sarah. I just wanted to ask if you could go a little bit more into when you touched on the different terms and you talked about different land rules for Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians. Can you talk a little bit about the differences there from the other tribes in the lower 48 and how their land is recognized and the sovereignty of their nations?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. So the lower 48 was settled, and policies that happened here, spanned several hundred years. And up in Alaska in particular, land claims didn't get settled until as recently as 1971. So although many of the US policies that were affecting Native peoples here in the lower 48 were carried out to some extent in some form or fashion in Alaska, land claims weren't settled and until much later. And so the state has a significant role also in engaging with Native communities, and state policies impact tribal communities in Alaska in different ways. And in particular, tribal nations themselves in Alaska don't have jurisdiction over lands in the same way that they do in the lower 48. So 229 of the 574 tribes in the United States are in Alaska. So that's about 40% of all tribal nations are there. But because of the way the land claims were settled in the early 70s, tribal nations don't have jurisdiction in the same way. So they have access to lands, but not jurisdiction over it in the same way. So that's been significant. And so some of the battles around natural resources, in particular, because so many tribes in Alaska still have subsistence practices, those challenges have played out differently in Alaska than they have in the lower 48. So just some different history there. And I should also maybe just say that the way land claims were settled in Alaska was intentionally different than the lower 48. So as Alaska Natives organized to try to interact with the federal government around land claims, there was an intentional decision to not replicate the reservation system that happened in the lower 48, but to try to do things differently. And so there was a different policy that settled those land claims, but that also has in many ways done a lot of damage and has had some really unintended consequences in Alaska also. But that's one of the major differences. Alaska became a state so much later, and then land claims were settled so much later. And so there've just been some different impacts there. And as for Native Hawaiians, although there has been some effort over actually several decades to support the recognition of Hawaiian natives as governments, that has not yet happened. So Hawaiian natives are indigenous people, but don't have the same governmental form that American Indians and Alaska Natives do. So there have been attempts to organize and to try to push forward for recognition of traditional governments in Hawaii, but there's still, from what I understand, different ideas about how to do that. Several times there's been legislation introduced in Congress that would recognize all Hawaiian natives under one native government. But that idea is not one about which there's consensus. Different Native Hawaiian people and groups have different ideas about how they want to be recognized in terms of governance. And so think there's just some ongoing discussion there about how to address that. And I would also say a lack of political will at the federal level to do that. So in particular, some tribes are concerned that if Native Hawaiians are recognized, particularly in a way that recognizes multiple tribal nations in Hawaii, that would impact the resources that are now flowing to tribes in the lower 48 and Alaska. So I think there are just questions still about how Native Hawaiians want to be recognized and what impact that will have on the community and how to manifest that in federal policy. So I think all of that is still kind of a work in progress.
And you may be going into this later, but that makes me think, how is the protection different under the ICWA Act for these
Thank
tribes
you.
that are not, recognized governments?
Excellent point. Yeah, we will be talking about ICWA specifically in just a few minutes, but the short answer to that is the Indian Child Welfare Act applies to citizens or members of federally recognized tribes. So it doesn't apply to members of state recognized tribes or unrecognized tribes, which would include Native Hawaiians. So unfortunately, those protections don't extend to them. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, well, there will be plenty more time for questions. So we'll go ahead and move forward 2 slides to our next segment. The next segment is going to be about the history of federal Indian policy. So we'll move forward 1 more slide. And before I talk specifically about policy here in the US, I wanted to step back and just take a minute to talk about the global experience of our Indigenous relatives the world over with regard to colonization. So here at NICWA, when we do trainings with communities, we talk about the global recipe for colonization, and that word choice is really intentional. So we say that the global recipe for colonization includes 5 ingredients. The first ingredient is to take the land. The second ingredient is to control the resources, the natural resources, especially water, so important, water. Third, to usurp Indigenous governance, so to supplant it. To instill mainstream models of governance that often aren't culturally aligned or a good fit for Native peoples, but to destroy Indigenous forms of governance. The fourth ingredient in our recipe is to delegitimize Indigenous thought and worldview. So that means to devalue and to cause Native people themselves to devalue their values, their way of life, their teachings, their traditions, their worldview, to call all of those things into question by calling them backwards and barbaric and savage and really devaluing those things. And the last and final ingredient in the recipe is to take the children. And that's really intentional because taking the children stops the socialization process. It severs children from their sense of identity, from their sense of belonging. It severs them from their connection to their extended family and to their broader community. So taking the children is an essential ingredient of the recipe for colonization. Next slide, please. So now I want to highlight just a couple of the policy periods here in the United States. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of these policy periods on Native communities and Native families in particular. So I wanted to start with 1819 and the Civilization Act. So this was federal policy intended to civilize and to Christianize Native people. It was a way of directing funding specifically to missionary schools that were supposed to provide for the moral education of Native students. So teachers in mission schools were expected to promote U.S. policies of assimilation through a curriculum that was completely devoid of any indigenous cultural knowledge, in the hope that it would transform Native students, Native children, into near copies of Anglo children. So these schools taught English and religion. They often were focused on manual labor, and definitely really emphasized traditional gender roles. So different kinds of labor for boys and for girls. And at this point in time, these schools were generally on reservation or in community. So reservations hadn't yet been established, but the idea was that it was on tribal lands. Children were being educated in the context of their community. So these weren't boarding schools that happened later, but these were schools that were in the community, local schools. But nonetheless did damage, didn't remove children as far away from home, but they made traditional culture and ways of being and ways of knowing shameful or wrong. So this kind of education affected families by disrupting traditional Native notions of gender and gender roles. It caused young people and ultimately their families to have shame about their natural ways of being that included their extended family, larger support networks, and parenting collectively. It attempted to force the Western family models and values onto Native families, and it really discouraged many of the ways that Native people and communities historically solved problems and how they promoted healing, their own cultural ways of healing. So these kinds of education systems, these kinds of schools really did a lot of damage to families in terms of moving that pendulum towards assimilation, really trying to assimilate Native children into broader mainstream society. So in the next slide, about 40 years later, the education system evolved, and Indian boarding schools outside of tribal communities really took hold. And this was a fairly long period of time in our history, for over 100 years. And at this stage, there's really a concerted effort to transform Native people by manipulating their children. Many policymakers believed that assimilation would be unsuccessful with adults, and so their focus was really on children. There is a belief that Indian children needed to be taken away from their quote unquote savage parents, and that boarding schools were the best mechanism to do this. These schools, at these schools, children were often beaten for speaking their language, for practicing their traditional ceremonies or beliefs. They were required to conform to Western standards, so uniforms, their hair was cut. So this is a deeply impactful policy here, separating children from their families, and this attempt at forced assimilation to transform Native children into their Anglo counterparts, into mainstream society. Boarding schools were a significant distance from Indian reservations, and so often families had no contact with their children for years at a time. Depending on the definition of Indian boarding school you use, so what kind of criteria you're using about how they're financed or how they're operated, there are between 400 and 500 boarding schools identified so far in this country, and children as young as 3 years old were removed from their families, and significant number of Native children went to these schools. So one data point that we have is that in 1926, about 83% of school-aged children, Native children who were school-aged, were educated in Indian boarding schools. So this was has such a pervasive effect on Native families and communities. The teachers at these schools were often encouraged with monetary incentives to bring back as many children as possible to these schools. So while some families believed that this kind of education might be in their children's best interest and allowed their children to go, in many other cases, there's forcible and involuntary removal of children from their families. There were communities where rations were withheld from families who were on reservations if they didn't permit their children to go to boarding schools. So really large proportion of the population impacted by this. And so as you can tell, this kind of policy, it broke families up. There was a great deal of abuse that happened in some of these boarding schools, many of them. So physical abuse, malnourishment, in some cases, sexual abuse. So this had such a pervasive impact on children and their families. It made children ashamed of their heritage, their family, their culture. It created a generation of children who went on to later become parents themselves, who had never learned how to parent. So children raised in boarding schools were parented by an institution, not in loving families. So to a significant degree, the challenges that that some Native communities and families have today around parenting directly relates back to the Indian boarding school movement. And I see Kent has a question in the chat about how the boarding schools were funded. There were federal appropriations set aside to fund these schools. And so that was the primary mechanism. But the federal government took resources from tribal lands and use those resources in turn to remove children from their families and to send them to boarding schools. So they were often using tribal resources directly to force this assimilation through the education system. So move on to the next slide. So as the general public learned more about what was happening in boarding schools, the number of children who perished there, the number of children who were running away to try to get back home and were severely punished for doing that. As the general public learned more about what was happening and the boarding schools waned in popularity, began to be defunded, the public child welfare system picked up where the boarding schools left off. So this is the same assimilation goals with a different system to carry it out now. So what had been previously happening in the education system is now shifting to child welfare system. So the Indian Adoption Project was a project that was around for a little over a decade. It was a public-private partnership. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Children's Bureau, so two federal government agencies, funded the Child Welfare League of America through a federal contract to take Indian children and adopt them into predominantly white families. So what's different about this policy is that the policy across the country, the adoption policy across the country at this point in time was very focused on race matching. So matching children who needed an adoptive family to a family of the same race. So this was an era when race matching dominated adoption practice. But here is the notable exception. So almost uniformly, systematically across the line, the intent during this period of time was to place an entire child population across the lines of their nation, their culture, their race. And so during this time period, 395 Native children from 16 Western states were placed with white families in Illinois, Indiana, New York, Massachusetts, Missouri, and several other states in the East and Midwest. So this was a really significant exception to the rest of adoption policy at the time, and was again thought to be in the best interest of Native children to be taken from their own family, from their poverty was often part of the calculation here, that children would do better in a family that had more resources. And so children were taken or stolen from their families and adopted into white families. On the next slide, going to talk a little bit about another policy period, 1940 to 1980. And so this is overlapping with those child removal policies we were just talking about. But here you see the federal government is trying to get out of the quote Indian business. So the goal here was for the federal government to let go of their responsibility to Native peoples and communities. And so at this time, Congress passed public law PL 280, Public Law 280 in 1952. And that law terminated the federal relationship, federal responsibility to tribes. And so 109 tribes were terminated during the termination era. And it also expanded state jurisdiction on tribal land. So again, this is the federal government backing out of their responsibility to tribes, saying we don't have a relationship with tribes anymore. Tribes, you're on your own. And so this had dramatic impact on tribal lands and states taking tribal lands. The federal government also during this time actively encouraged Native people to leave their reservations, to leave their tribal lands. So this is the relocation component here. And so 750,000 people, 750,000 people were moved from their traditional lands to urban centers, again, with the goal of assimilation. And you see this ad here that was an ad marketing to Native people, leave your community, come to Denver, it's the chance of a lifetime. So here, people were promised houses and jobs and a better life in urban centers. And actually, once people came to these areas, to these urban centers, none of those things were there. So basically what happened was people left their families, their communities, their safety nets, all of the resources that were in their home community to go to a new place to get a job and find a home and have educational opportunities, and none of those resources or supports were in place. So people were separated from their families, from their cultures, and you have continued erosion here of protections and supports for families, as basically the federal government is quote unquote getting out of the Indian business. And in the next slide, I want to talk about a positive development here as the pendulum swung in the opposite direction. So we talked a lot about those assimilation policies that were carried out across different systems to assimilate families. But here in the 1962 to 1980 period of time, we have the self-determination era. So during this policy period, Presidents Kennedy and Nixon supported tribal sovereignty and self-determination. There was really important legislation that was passed by Congress during this period, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which was passed in 1975, which allowed tribal nations to contract for services that the federal government previously provided for them on Indian lands. So this was an opportunity for tribes to have access to those resources and then to deliver the services themselves to their own citizens. So you really see here stronger recognition of tribal sovereign authority and tribes' ability to self-determine their own future and to govern their own affairs. And so on the next slide, I just want to share a little bit of data here as we start to talk about impact on families and kids, and as the acknowledgement of self-determination starts to accelerate. There's a lot of policy that gets passed in this period that's pro-tribal sovereignty, that supports tribal self-determination. But when we look at what was going on at this point in time, I mean, these numbers are just staggering, right? A quarter to a third of all Native children removed from their homes, and of those children, 85% placed in non-Native homes. So again, that continued assimilation goal, even as tribal sovereignty and self-determination are, the seeds are being sown for that to be recognized. So the impact of this, of course, is children being brought up in non-Native homes, separated from their family, from their community and culture, not having access to their culture as a protective factor, often, separated from their identity, not knowing much about their extended family. So at this point in time, tribal leaders from across the country started to realize that it wasn't just their community that was in this situation. It wasn't just happening on their reservation, on their tribal land, but actually happening across Indian country. So an organization called the Association on American Indian Affairs did some work with tribes to gather data about the rates of removal. And ultimately, these statistics were brought to Congress, where tribal leaders implored members of Congress to stop this massive forced removal of children from their communities. So I'm going to cover just a few more slides, and then we're going to take a break so that we can shake some of this out of our bodies, get a cool drink of water, and come back and talk about our next component. But just to kind of wrap this portion up here, I wanted to share this definition of historical trauma that comes from a Lakota psychiatrist, Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. Her definition of historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, emanating from massive group trauma. And so what I wanted to say here about this history that we've been talking about is that historical trauma is trauma that's carried from generation to generation and is at the core of many of the social problems that many American Indian, Alaska Native families experience today, and that this trauma gets compounded across generations through the impairment of traditional parenting skills and through the loss of tradition, language, values. So the symptoms of historical trauma are things like alcohol and drug abuse, suicide, violence, child abuse and neglect. So this historical trauma is real lived experience of individual people, and it gets compounded by institutional bias in different public and private child welfare systems, where Native children and their families continue to receive the most intrusive interventions and have the most disproportionate placement in out-of-home care. So this impact of the generations of policy that we've talked about, impacting children and their families compounded over time. And so what people are carrying, their lived experience, gets compounded by institutional bias, by the bias in systems that are far less likely to offer families services and supports to help keep their children safely at home, and are much more likely to remove children even at their first encounter with the child welfare system. And historical trauma gets transmitted through adverse childhood experiences. So on the next slide, as I was mentioning, tribal leaders lobbied Congress. They went to Congress to talk about the damage to their communities, the families who are experiencing this massive forced removal of their children. And tribal leaders convinced Congress to act. So in 1978, which was in that policy period where tribal sovereignty is being recognized, self-determination is a policy goal at this period in time. And so Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, acknowledging three things: acknowledging tribal sovereignty, that tribes are governments, tribal nations have a political relationship with their citizens. They have the right and the responsibility to protect their member children and families. The Indian Child Welfare Act also acknowledged tribal self-determination. So it recognized that tribes know their members best, and they are best positioned to determine what's in children's best interests. So tribal nations themselves are the best decision makers for their citizen children. And then finally, the federal trust responsibility. So the Indian Child Welfare Act was Congress's pledge to ensure that the cultural continuity of tribes and continued existence of tribes as distinct nations continued into the future. So on the next slide, we'll just talk very quickly about three things that the Indian Child Welfare Act does. It establishes minimum federal standards for removal of children from their families. So the way I think about this is as guardrails. Because of that history of removal of children, the Indian Child Welfare Act establishes minimum standards. It puts up guardrails for the minimum things that have to be true in order for Native children to be removed from their families. And minimum is an important word to emphasize here, because the Indian Child Welfare Act, we say, is the floor, not the ceiling. So states can always do more, but ICWA provides minimum standards. The Indian Child Welfare Act also recognizes tribes' inherent tribal jurisdiction over child custody proceedings. So tribes can transfer cases to tribal courts and have the ability to provide services and supports to their citizen children and family through their own systems. And then the third thing that ICWA does is that it provides actually some pretty minimal tribal funding for the operation of child and family programs. But this was the first funding that tribes received back in 1978, first funding to operate these kinds of services for kids and families. And so when ICWA was passed, about a third of tribes were funded to start to develop these programs and services. And today, this federal program is about a $23 million program. So those resources go directly to tribal nations, to the 574 tribal nations. And I think it's worth noting that, you know, ICWA is a $23 million program. And if we look at some of the other federal child welfare programs, things like Social Security Act programs, Title 4B and 4E, Title 4E alone is $8 billion. So there's a big difference in kind of the funding level and support for a range of services between state and tribal programs. So on the next slide, as we get ready for our break, we'll just say that that although ICWA is a positive development, that it has impacted the lives of thousands of children, have helped them to stay safely at home with their families when that's possible. But this process of colonization isn't over. It's not over yet. That many efforts to take the children still continue to this day. And since 2016, there have been waves of ICWA litigation that challenge the constitutionality of this law. And it's important to recognize that those attacks on the Indian Child Welfare Act are not just about tribal children. They're not just about Native children and about non-Native families who want to foster or adopt Native children. But very clearly, this is also a direct attack on tribal sovereignty. And so most recently, the Supreme Court heard the case Holland v. Brackeen, handed down that decision in June of 2023. And in that decision, clearly addressed a number of the constitutional challenges to ICWA, but did not address the issue of equal protection. So opponents of ICWA have tried to challenge the law by saying that ICWA is a race-based law, when in fact, ICWA is a law based on tribal citizenship. The Indian Child Welfare Act only applies to children who are members of a federally recognized tribe or who have a parent, a biological parent who is a member of a tribe, if the child is also eligible. So it's very limited. The protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act apply to a very specific population of children who are citizens of federally recognized tribes. But the US Supreme Court didn't rule on that challenge to equal protection, and in fact said that the parties that brought the case didn't have standing to bring it. So they weren't able to get their concern redressed through law. There wasn't an appropriate remedy, and so they didn't have standing to bring that challenge. So it's important to recognize that although, you know, this effort started hundreds of years ago, that it has been reinforced and reinvented in numerous different systems over time. It continues to be replicated, and that today efforts to take the children are still alive and well in many contexts. Because there is a larger agenda, and the larger agenda is tribal sovereignty. So even the organizations who have brought challenges previously, places like the Goldwater Institute, a think tank in Arizona, for example, these ICWA opponents continue to bring other challenges to tribal sovereignty that have nothing to do with Native children. So they're replicating this strategy of challenging the constitutionality of a variety of federal laws that pertain to Native communities, that pertain to tribal governments, and raising these same challenges over and over in reference to other laws. So, for example, there are challenges to the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act that were brought in Washington state that are using this same formula for constitutional challenges. So on the one hand, colonization continues to be replicated in our systems today. And on the other hand, it's important to recognize that challenges to ICWA are not just about Native children, but there really is a much larger political agenda here. And so I think we will go ahead and take a break, and then we're going to come back and have a little bit of time to reflect after we watch a short video. So just want to acknowledge that that was a whole lot of information, and really a lot of challenging information to hear and to think about. And just want to offer you the opportunity to take a little walk, to get some water, to talk to somebody that you love, to get a hug from a family member if you're working from home today. But go ahead and take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together and watch a really wonderful video about the impact of the Indian Child Welfare Act on a family here in Oregon. So with that, I will thank you for your time and attention, and offer you a break. See you in about 10 minutes.
My name is Lucas Angus, born and raised in Portland, Oregon. Enrolled in Nez Perce. I'm also Cayuse. That's from my dad's side. I'm also Tlingit Haida descent from my mom's side. As far as I know, when I was born, I was immediately adopted.
It was pretty much decided for us. The doctor gave me a private attorney's name, and we never talked about the end result of Lucas being born and if I was going to keep him and raise him. And we just called the attorney. He came in and sat down. I signed the papers, and that was it. I was sick. I became anorexic. I didn't eat for almost 2 months, and I got a call from the attorney, and he said that we made a mistake and you need to go to court and give him up again. And I said no. That was the beginning of the adoption battle.
The woman who adopted me, in our case, she wasn't knowledgeable of the law and ended up with a child that she adopted illegally without her knowledge of that. The legal proceedings to get me back took, I think, almost 2 years.
I had no idea what I was up against, but I was willing to do what it took. The very first visit, I sat on the floor and he walked around me. And then he just all of a sudden came over and looked at me in the face and then sat down on my lap, and he put his ear up to my heart. He remembered my heartbeat. If ICWA would have been complied with, so much time would have not been wasted. Counseling, broken hearts. The adoptive parents and we were fighting for something very dear and precious. She did what she had to do. I did what I had to do.
The problem with me was there's too many people that wanted to have me and love me.
The end result of ICWA it's amazing. It's amazing to see it in place right here.
Culture around you and gives you something greater than just me. It takes away the selfishness, but it also, in a way, it is kind of all about you and making you stronger, and it makes everyone involved with that culture more connected to each other and their surroundings, and a better person to offer themselves to the world. My Nez Perce name is Wietska Ilbilt, which means red spike elk. My dad and that side of the family was really strong in the Nez Perce traditions, and I have good memories of the elders in that family making my moccasins and my regalia, my ribbon shirt, and put me on the dance floor. Each piece that I wear is for a special reason. These were made by my wife, and this is my great grandmother's bandana. This is a feather from my uncle. This is my medicine bag. It has various things that bring me strength. It has love in it, and it has the strength of my family. That sort of identity to your culture is what empowers you. I had to give my kids that sense of identity as well. When my first daughter was born, I wasn't really strong in the community, so I started introducing my little family to the Portland Native community a little bit at a time, the powwows and the Native Center. And now my other two kids, they've sort of been born into that. A few years back, the elders decided that as the canoe journeys are happening in Washington and Alaska, it was time to start a canoe family here. The canoe family is our extended family within the community. That's our way of prayer. That's our sacrifice. And it brings us strength too. The elders had that vision, and somehow I became an important person in that vision of theirs. The role I've taken as a skipper is one that puts a lot of responsibility on me to steer the canoe, and so everyone who's paddling has trust in me. I've thought my whole life about, what if I didn't, end up back with my family? Things would have been totally different. I would have been a different person. This culture that I carry would be gone. With ICWA in place, we have the protection of our children and our families. It brings strength to our communities, And it brings strength to the coming generation of natives to take care of their kids and to raise happy people.
Great, thank you for sharing that video. We'll go back to our slide deck now. Hope you had a good mini break, that you felt the sunlight on your face or had a chance to take a little walk. We're going to turn to another 4-minute reflection now. So Shannon's going to count down our 4 minutes. We put the questions in the chat. They're also on the slide. But we'd invite you to just reflect a little bit about your knowledge of Native peoples and how it impacts your lens and understanding of history, of systems, of disproportionality and disparities. And as you think about that, to notice where your curiosity leads you, where you have some energy about those questions. So we'll give you about 4 minutes.
Do you know I love you so, and mommy will never let you go. To the stars and the sky, you'll always be mommy's little guy. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, way, oh, hey, oh, oh. Do you know I love you so, and mommy will never let you go. To the stars and the sky, you'll always be mommy's little guy. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, way, oh, hey, way, oh, hey, oh, oh. Do you know I love you so, and mommy will never let you go. To the stars and the sky, you'll always be mommy's little guy. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, way, oh, oh.
We've got about 1 more minute of reflection left.
I love you so, and mommy will never let you go. To the stars and the sky, you'll always be mommy's little guy. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, way, oh, hey, way, oh, hey, 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 oh
at Mint Mobile.
Great. So as you wrap up your reflection, we'll go ahead and move to some questions now. So we'll pause and see if there are questions about any of the things we've talked about so far. Kelly has a comment or a question about why hasn't more land been returned? Land back is a fairly recent movement, and there have been some good outcomes in some places where there are deep relationships, I would say, and a willingness to try to reconcile the past, to try to tell the truth about the harm that was done, and to try to reconcile the past. But as you point out, that's not a prevalent phenomenon. It hasn't happened in many places. And I think that although a growing number of people do know some of this history, at least some portions of it, that people tend to think that this is the ancient past, that these are things that happened a long time ago, and that people should. So I'll just say a comment that people, frequently say is, when are you going to get over it? Yeah, it happened. That was hundreds of years ago. Actually, in the case of the policies we just talked about, that's pretty recent history, some of those things in my lifetime. But the sentiment about, can you just get over it? And our founder here at NICWA, Terry Cross, he's a Seneca man, and what he always says is, I'll get over it when you stop doing it. So the idea that these harms continue, maybe they look different, maybe they're being replicated in different systems, but they're perpetuating the same kind of harm that they have for centuries. And so I think there's just not much public willingness to do something about this. You may be aware that there's legislation in Congress. It's been introduced in the last 2 Congresses, but there is a bill that would establish a federal Indian boarding school commission to actually investigate Indian boarding schools. Historically, their existence and activities, and more about what actually happened, trying to put records together from lots of different places to tell a fuller story, to see the true picture, but also to really dig into this question of the impact of those policies on generations of Native kids and their families. And that bill has had some real challenges in Congress, although the Senate is planning to have a floor block today. So we'll see what happens today, but there's companion bills in the House and Senate that are trying to make some progress on recognizing some of that history, have an opportunity for reconciliation, for healing to happen in that regard. There's a question about when the last boarding school closed. Actually, there are Indian boarding schools still in operation today. Although the schools that are funded today are dramatically different from the ones that we talked about. But the Bureau of Indian Affairs still does fund and operate boarding schools, several handfuls of them. But often those schools now are much more culturally based, so almost the exact opposite of what happened historically. The schools that are in existence now are focused on culturally based education and providing an opportunity for students to continue their education while it's done from a cultural perspective. And then Lisa has a comment about shouldn't we stop perpetuating before we start investigating? That's a great comment. Yeah. And thanks, Kimberly. Great. Any other questions that people want to talk a little bit about? Ramona, thank you, Ramona. What can persons here today do to impact legislation to reverse laws? Well, many of the policies that we talked about, particularly the most damaging ones, are no longer the formal policy of this government. But there's, the remnants, the impacts are still here today. And Native kids are still disproportionately represented in the child welfare system. So we know they continue to be separated from their families at disproportionate rates. And as I said earlier, there's data that shows that judges are more likely to take Native kids from their families, even at a first instance. When a family comes into contact with the child welfare system, they're less likely to offer services and supports to kids and families to allow them to stay safely at home to address challenges that they face. So there's a lot of bias and discrimination in the system, even if it's not the formal policy. So all of these things are happening in layers, right? We have whatever the formal policy says, we have whatever is going on at the implementation level with the organizations and institutions that are implementing the policy. And then there's also the individual human level of bias and discrimination at that level as well. So multiple layers that this is playing out on. And, as a social worker, one of the things that I find hopeful about that complexity is that it means there's a lot of ways to attack it. So although it's operating on different levels and through many different mechanisms, it means there's also lots of levers for change. And even when progress seems to be hindered or blocked on a certain level, then we can go at it from a different way. Then there's something else we can do from a different standpoint. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about this series and the work that you're all doing here is, really that work towards healing-centered engagement. So what is it that we can do together in small groups and in large coalitions to remedy some of these situations, the things that are still going on today? So we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But I think at this point, we've got about 45 minutes left. So I want to go ahead and move on to our next segment. And I'm really excited to share this portion with you. And some of it will go kind of quickly, but I really want to talk a little bit about culture and worldview, and then to reserve some time at the end where we can have more discussion. We can talk kind of about all of these things in concert, this kind of whole trajectory that we've been on together today. So on the next slide, what comes to mind when we think of culture? So I have a number of bullets here, just some things that we often think about when we hear the word culture. We think about spirituality and religion. We think about art and music and dance. We think about language or stories. We think about social rules, manners, norms. Think about clothing, food. So there are lots of different dimensions, lots of different aspects to culture. So cultures are complex, and everybody has a culture. On the next slide, we're going to relate the items on that list to our definition of what culture is. So our definition of culture is that it's an integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior, that it is the customary beliefs, the social norms, the material traits of a group, of a racial, religious, or social group. And it's important to acknowledge that many of us belong to multiple cultures, not just a single culture. On the next slide, you see this diagram that many of you may already be familiar with. It's something that we use in a lot of our training work. But this cultural iceberg really points to the powerful influence that culture has on us as a people. And so I like to use this to help us to think about, on the one hand, the white portion of the iceberg, the portion that's above the water, is how we can think about surface or visible culture. So the aspects of culture that we can all see. And as you can tell, it's a small proportion of culture overall, but this is the surface culture, the things that are visible, the things that are obvious that we can see about culture. So things like literature or food or dress or language, those are some of the visible or surface aspects of culture. But the majority of culture is deep or unseen or hidden culture. It's the portion under the water there. And there are some really significant things here that are part of the hidden culture, things that you can't tell just by looking at somebody or being with somebody in a community, for example. But there are things that you would have to work harder to know more about. So part of our deep culture or hidden culture, things that aren't as obvious, are things like our concepts of justice and fairness, what our attitude is towards age, for example, our views on raising children, or our approaches to problem solving. So all of these things are ways that our cultures impact us at an unseen or unobvious way. These are aspects of culture that are below the surface. And when we just think about the slides that we reviewed earlier about federal Indian policy and the notion of colonization more globally, it's important to recognize that colonization didn't just attack the surface elements of culture, but the very intention of colonization was to attack deep culture too, to really try to promote assimilation by changing those aspects of the deep culture as well, things like religious beliefs, for example. So if we move to the next slide, I'm going to invite you to take another 4-minute reflection. And I want to invite you to think about that cultural iceberg. And importantly, to think about the time that you had an opportunity to deeply experience a culture that's different from yours. And so the invitation is to think about what stood out to you about that experience, and how did experiencing a different culture teach you about your own culture. So we'll take about 4 minutes, and you'll have a chance to reflect and to jot some notes down.
about one more minute of reflection.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. And I've got a couple of slides here that I'm going to cover pretty quickly so that we can get to the point of talking in more detail about the linear and relational worldview. But as we said previously, worldview is just one of the components that makes up culture. And we think about worldview as a collective or shared thought process of a group of people. So I mentioned earlier Terry Cross, who's the founder of our organization. And Terry often jokes that a worldview is, quote, the big idea, because thoughts are organized into ideas, ideas into concepts, concepts are organized into constructs, constructs into paradigms, and paradigms are organized into worldview. So on the next slide, you can see how our worldview consolidates our way of knowing. It brings together all of those aspects of our way of knowing. So we're going to talk a little bit about two different worldviews. A linear worldview, which is a Western European worldview, and a relational worldview or an indigenous worldview. And I'm using the word indigenous intentionally here to reference something that's common across many indigenous communities and peoples around the world. And our intention here in talking about these two worldviews and the differences between them isn't to put one above the other or suggest that one is better or more meaningful than the other, but really just to point out that there are different ways of being in the world and that these different worldviews influence our communication and our behavior and are something that's important for us to understand as we consider healing. So on the next slide, we are going to talk about this linear worldview and the relational worldview. So on the next slide, we'll look at the linear worldview. In most academic disciplines, including social work, which is where my training was, but also in many other helping professions, we're trained into a linear worldview that's reflected in the medical model also, that characterizes European and American thought. And this worldview is organized around a pattern of cause and effect. And now I'm going to talk more in detail about this worldview in a relational worldview, but I want to preface that with an acknowledgement that there's lots of variation along the continuum. So I'm talking about these two worldviews in a way that highlights some of the extremes, some of the contrast between them. But it's important to recognize that even obviously within the Western European American population, within the indigenous population, that there's lots of variation. And it's also important to recognize that many of us are quite adept at code switching. So we can jump back and forth between these different worldviews, these different ways of being based on the context, based on the situation and the environment that we're in. So we're not trying to kind of overgeneralize here. I think that's the danger, is to believe that all native or non-native people are just in a certain camp, just like completely distinct and different. But what we're trying to do in this comparison is to show some of the similarities and differences so that we can be better communicators and show up in our engagement with our behavior in really intentional ways. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about this cause and effect pattern. So in a social work or medical model, we see this pattern of cause and effect. And we would see the social history as the social history helps us to identify what the presenting problem is. So we interview a client, we talk with somebody that we're treating in order to understand what the problems are that they present with. And then we do an assessment and we prescribe a treatment. And then we expect the outcome to address the presenting problem. And we would expect the client's condition to improve. So that's the kind of pattern of cause and effect that underlies the linear worldview. On the next slide, we'll see what the theory of change is. So from a linear perspective, a linear worldview, the theory of change is given this, if we do this, then this will happen. On the next slide, but culture matters. Culture shapes our worldview, it shapes our behavior, it shapes our communication. And so from a different cultural orientation, we have the relational worldview on the next slide. So the relational worldview has its roots in tribal cultures. It is intentionally a composite of indigenous teachings from different places. So we're not kind of privileging one kind of tribal philosophy, but this is really intentionally bringing together some similarities across many different indigenous peoples and groups. So it's a composite. And what we're looking at here is the kind of balance and harmony in relationships between multiple variables. So we achieve balance, we achieve harmony when these quadrants, when these different components, these different variables are brought together. And you can see that one of those four quadrants, one of those four components are spiritual forces. So they also contribute to balance. So health and well-being, whether it's in individual people and families and communities and organizations, health and wellness are said to exist only when things are in balance. And we think about people's ability to thrive when the circle is in harmony, when it's in balance. All of these components are in balance. So on the next slide, we have a couple of hallmarks of this worldview. The relational worldview is intuitive, it's non-time oriented, and it's fluid. All of the causal factors are considered together, and it's the interdependence of the relationships between all of those factors taken at once that really allows us to understand behavior. In this worldview, a relational worldview, helpers and healers are taught to understand problems through the balances and imbalances in a person's relational world. So we're taught to see and accept complex interrelationships that can be influenced by manipulating the balance in one or more of those four quadrants. And from this worldview, the question of how to restore balance is much more relevant than why something happened. So the focus is really on restoring balance. From this perspective, interventions don't need to be logically targeted to a particular symptom or cause, but interventions focus on bringing the person back into balance. And this perspective also acknowledges that nothing in a person's existence can change without all other things being impacted by that as well. So one change, like the drop in a pond, ripples out many more changes. It has a far-reaching impact. On the next slide, we'll give some examples of what falls into these quadrants. So the relational worldview model is illustrated with this circle that's divided into four quadrants. And the quadrants represent the four major forces or sets of factors that need to come into balance together to provide wellness. So these quadrants are the context, the mind, the body, and the spirit. And as you can see, the mind quality quadrant includes our cognitive processes, so all of the things related to our thoughts and memories and knowledge, as well as our emotional processes. So things like our feelings, our defenses, our self-esteem. In the body quadrant, we have all the physical aspects, so things like genetic inheritance, gender, condition, as well as things like sleep and nutrition and substance use. The context quadrant includes culture and community, peers, family, work, those kinds of things. And then our spiritual quadrant includes both positive and negative learned teachings and practices, as well as positive and negative metaphysical or innate forces. So in that quadrant, we can think about things like superstitions or karma, and we can also think of formal religion as being there. So a variety of things included there. And the idea is that these quadrants are in a constant state of change and flux. We're not the same person at 4 o'clock in the afternoon as we are at 7 o'clock in the morning. Our level of sleep is different, our nutrition is different, and our context is likely different. So our behavior is different, our feelings are different, what we're thinking about is different. So this system is constantly balancing and rebalancing itself as we change our thoughts, our feelings, our physical state, our spiritual state. And we naturally tend to this balance. So this is an amazing thing about human beings, is often without even being aware of it, we are doing things to try to help ourselves maintain this balance. We seek equilibrium. We do it without even thinking about it. When we're hungry, we get a snack. When we're tired, we take a nap. When we're lonely, we connect with family or friends. So we're attending to this balance all the time. If we're able to stay in balance, then we're said to be healthy. But sometimes our balance is temporarily lost. In my community, there's an elder who talked to me about this, and she describes it as getting wobbly. So sometimes we're able to maintain our balance, but sometimes we get wobbly. And we have the capacity as humans to keep our own balance for the most part. And different cultures help provide different mechanisms for assisting in this process. So things like spiritual teachings, social skills and norms, dietary rules, family roles, all of these things are ways that our different cultures help us maintain our balance. And again, health and well-being are said to exist when these 4 quadrants come into balance. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about values. So looking at the world this way, having a linear model has a different set of values than a relational model. So this way of looking at the world values specific things. It values facts and measurement and timelines and individuality. It values compartmentalizing things, breaking something down to its smallest parts as a way to understand something. It values credentials. And on the next slide, we see that the relational worldview has a different set of values, that some of these contrast with the linear worldview values. So, for example, in this perspective, wisdom is valued over knowledge. And one way of thinking about or defining wisdom is that wisdom is knowledge in context. This worldview values things happening in their own time, as opposed to a rigid timeline with an emphasis on clock time and punctuality. Observation is valued as another scientific method. Generosity is valued over accumulation. Indirect communication is not telling people what to do, but it's storytelling, telling things indirectly. Oral tradition is valued over writing things down. Cycles and phases are valued rather than steps and stages. And holistic thinking is valued over breaking something into parts. And these differences in values impact how we interact with one another. So on the next slide, we have the theory of change for the relational worldview. So in this worldview, change is inevitable, it's constant, it's a cyclical part of the human experience. Change occurs in natural, predictable patterns, but it can also be facilitated to promote a particular outcome, a desired outcome. When we're out of balance, we don't have to stay stuck where we are. We can't control all of the things that are swirling around us, but we can control some things. And often we can work to restore our own balance. When we regularly assess our balance and when we intentionally adjust the necessary elements in our quadrants to promote better balance, then we can be said to be building our intentional resilience. So on the next slide, we're going to do a 4-minute reflection. And I'm just inviting you to think about what kind of implications these different worldviews might have for communication and engagement. So we'll let you think about this for a few minutes, and then we'll come back together to answer some questions and then also to get into deeper discussion, particularly about how we apply this in the work that you all are doing.
Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, 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 hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Little one, close your eyes. Mommy will stay here by your side because I love you. Because I love you. I'll be here always and forever. Always and forever. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Little one, close your eyes. Mommy will stay here by your side because I love you. Because I love you. I'll be here always and forever. Always and forever, forever. Way out, way out. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Little one, close your eyes. Mommy will stay here by your side because I love you. Because I love you. I'll be here always and forever. Always and forever. Way out, way out. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh.
All right, stop.
So we're closing in on the end of our session, and I'm hoping that we're ready for more interaction now. So we have an invitation on the next slide to ask any questions about what I've just shared with you. If you're curious about anything about these worldviews, happy to answer questions about that. And also have questions on the next slide about some suggested discussion. So really thinking more deeply about pivoting from lens to mirror. So just open our time up and would love to hear from you. Feel free to put something in the chat or come off mute, but would love to hear what you're thinking, what's sitting with you in this conversation.
Hi there. So a lot comes up for me being a member of a state recognized tribe. A lot of this learning process, because I'm an urban native who was displaced away from my culture. So I didn't really connect with this part of who I was until now in my adult years. And I just have this passion to want to learn more and get involved, and how can I advocate for others. I think about this, and 3 out of 4 of my sisters did have their children removed. And I look at some of the things that you're teaching, and the attitudes and the worldviews, and I can see how our upbringing and our culture alluded to the biases of the system and put us at a disadvantage, and being that we're not federally recognized, like we talked about earlier when I was questioning about the Hawaiian natives, we didn't have those protections then. So I think really where my mind is at right now is, how do we advocate for our clients that do have a relational worldview, and are not adhering to, like, say, their certain parts of their case plan. Like, they might be getting things done, but the timing is off, or little things that may lead a social worker to think that they're not engaging or taking this seriously. You hear a lot of that, like, they're not engaging, they're not taking it seriously, they're not on time. Like, how do we advocate for those clients, and then how do we communicate to those clients that that those things are important and necessary, because we need the worker to see your effort and document that in order for your children to be returned. I mean, I guess those are just hard conversations to have, right?
Wow, they really are hard conversations to have, but you're right that these different worldviews play out in communication and engagement in a helping relationship in very specific ways. So I appreciate you pointing out some of the differences in like perceptions of time, for example, and quote unquote, how seriously somebody is taking something. And so I do think there's a lot of work to do to educate service providers about different worldviews. We're just finishing a resource that will be up on our website soon that talks about Native perspectives in child development. And so this is a tip sheet for service providers specifically, and it does address relational versus linear worldview. That's one small part of the tip sheet, but it addresses a number of other factors, just prompting service providers to think about there may be a different way of looking at things. Like, one of the things about culture is when we're swimming in our own culture, we often don't recognize the values of our culture. We may not recognize how our communication or our behavior is shaped by our culture. But when we're in a different culture, then often we have an opportunity to really learn some things about our own culture, some things that we didn't even realize. And so the point of this tip sheet is really to help service providers think that there could be a different way of perceiving these things. And in particular, with regard to child development, traditional Native parenting really values a lot of autonomy for children, even at a young age. So children learning by observing, learning by mimicking, trying to do something themselves after they watch somebody else do it. But there's a lot of autonomy around that often in Native parenting, traditional Native parenting. And so how do we help service providers see different ways of learning, different learning styles as another valid way of parenting and children learning, for example. So that tip sheet that we'll have up soon could be really helpful. We've also done a toolkit for service providers that helps to explain some of this background about. It has very briefly a little bit about the history, but goes into much more detail about how some of these differences in worldview and values could impact service provision. So I believe that that is already in the list of resources we're going to send you after this webinar is over. But I tried to put together a lot of things that I think will be helpful to all of you, including this really important point you're raising about how these different worldviews play out and how they impact relationships, particularly in a helping relationship. It's a great question. Other thoughts, questions, things that you're sitting with?
Yes, Sarah. For me, this is like truly new learning. You know, I'm, you know, I always say I know a lot about a lot of things, but I knew this is just totally new. So it's taken me a little bit aback because I pride myself in being knowledgeable, right, about things. So there's a lot to reflect on. So I appreciate the opportunities to reflect over the 4 minutes. But I guess there was a point I was going to make about the new learning. I guess for me, it's been my experience that when I am truly exposed to new learning, that it's for a reason. There's something coming. And so I await why I have been brought to this space. So thank you for sharing this, and I know that I can use it in the work that I'm doing with our youth who are in foster care and that sort of thing. But I anticipate the need for this information. And so thank you for sharing. And I'm just really curious, and I'll be visiting your website so I can learn a lot more. Thank you.
Gosh, I really appreciate that philosophy that you have. It's very similar to one of our teachings, which is, we believe that the Creator put us in the place that we are. And sometimes even if I have self-doubt, like, geez, should I really be the one who's doing this? Am I the most qualified person here? Maybe this job isn't for me. But we really believe that that our ancestors lived in a time that was more challenging than the time we live in now. And in their journey, they thought about what should come next, who are the people that will come next. And they prayed for us. And we believe that our ancestors prayed very specifically for us, for our strengths and the talents that we need to do the work that we do, but also, just as importantly, for the challenges and the gaps that we each have, because it's those challenges and gaps that remind us that we can't do anything alone, and we really do need each other in order to do this work. And part of the way that I think about this is, if the Creator is putting us where we are, if our ancestors prayed us into being and we're where we're supposed to be. No matter if I sometimes have questions about, am I really the right person to be doing this? If the Creator put me here, then He prepared me in ways that I don't even know, and in ways that I don't even see. But most certainly, if I look back on my journey, there will be ways that the Creator was preparing me for all the things that I needed to do.
Ashe.
And we did drop a little survey in the chat for your feedback about this session, so we'd very much appreciate that. We think of feedback as a gift that you can give. So if you can share with us what really worked for you and what we can do better, we'd really love to hear about that.
Also, my name is Ramona Topaski. I'm Eastern District Chief of the Tsalagi and Adagi, which is the Cherokee people of Texas. And I've sat and I've listened and I work as a respite service supervisor for Lutheran Services in Iowa. I've had that position for about 10 years, but I have served the people in the community in Waterloo, Iowa for over 25 years in different forms. But I share with one person the not knowing the true being of who I was until about 20 years ago, 25 years. Okay. I know that in one place I had put a note of I'm third generation adopted Indian, which is true. My great grandmother lost her children due to not knowing how to raise kids. My grandmother lost her children not knowing how to raise kids. And my mother lost me not knowing how to raise kids. So the generational trauma comes real in this heart. And I know that one of the person's question, not being a federally recognized tribe, you're kind of lost. And I would just encourage you to reach out to the people, to your people, because the grandmothers carry the knowledge, the children carry the grandchildren. You think on that really hard. We talk about our ancestors, but the children carry the grandchildren. And their children will carry their grandchildren. And that's where the whole concept of interrelatedness really opens eyes and opens hearts. But I do want to thank you for this time, for this learning, because it's something that when I said, what can we do to affect the laws? The real heart of it is from here, from this moment, is there anything each and every individual here can take with them to share, to open up those closed hearts that we still have in this world, that still believe, Indians are a thing of the past, happened back then. I can go to many communities and simply mention that I'm Native American, and for some reason I go from this white looking person to scum. So that just blows my mind every time. So I'll stop talking now so that you can have more conversations with others, but I truly am thankful for the teachings that were here today. I hope so.
Thank you so much. We might have time for about one more comment or question if anybody else would like to share.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in quick. So, when you were talking about the, worldview shifts from sort of a cause and effect and getting to the root cause compared to having things in balance, it made me think about how a lot of our work is driven by trying to address, usually on more of like a community level, the root causes or main drivers of inequities. And that's like so much of the focus of our work that we support. Excuse me. And I think I'm just like curious about how to shift to incorporate more of that. The concepts you were talking about of keeping things in balance. And you're right, like before we had this, Western idea of how to approach this type of work, for centuries, humans have been finding balance their own ways. So I just appreciated that reflection.
Thank you, Naomi. I think where your question takes me is to a both and approach, because I really appreciate you talking about not just structural analysis, but really getting to the root causes. That's powerful work. That's important work. And I don't think there's anything that we're sharing today that would suggest that that's not something that is necessary and should continue. But I think the offering is maybe to think about how we, as you just said, kind of bring in the relational worldview as a complement to that. And so honestly, the first thing that comes to me is something that's very much related to direct practice, but in the field of tribal child welfare, we've done some work with tribes to even think about how do you use the relational worldview as the basis for family assessment? How would a family assessment look different if you are looking at both the strengths and the gaps around all of those quadrants of the worldview? And how much of a fuller picture would that give us about what a family's strengths and challenges are? And then how do we use that assessment as a way to build a case plan that also has that holistic perspective, looking around the relational worldview as a tool to develop a case plan to help a family. So I think there are ways that we can bring some of that thinking in alongside some of the other work that's being done, that's really looking at specific policies and practices and things we need to change. But really thinking about relationally, what are the other ways that people can come together in balance, that we can attend to a family's balance in thinking about their well-being, in applying that to children. So I think it's more of a both and is where my mind goes. I think we're nearly at time here. So I wonder if my job is to turn it back over to our facilitators to close us out. Koyana, thank you.
If we can just like uplift like a round of applause, appreciations, gratitude towards Sarah, towards Nikwa, towards just the entire body of work that you brought towards us. And we know that you stand on the shoulders of your ancestors and of your tribe and represent so many voices. So we have so much gratitude. We only have 1 minute, but I would love if we can drop in the chat just like one takeaway, right? Like something that you are leaving here with as we close this circle and seal this in. Like I am taking away holistic care. I'm taking away honoring different types of culture. I see Kelly, I'm taking away balance. Yes. And as you drop those into the chat, just have a moment to read those, feel the connection, and we'll seal this time together. Kent, would you mind playing us one last song as we close out? Oh, I'm taking away power. Yes. Openness. Remembering. Relationship. Thank you all, and we hope to see you at the next Racial Equity Series, September 18th.